So, Cliff, Malmkrog, what did you think?
This film was hard work, really hard work. Um, you know, I agree with the idea that any film over 90 minutes has to kind of justify why it's longer than 90 minutes. You know, recently we've watched a lot of films which have been inside 90 minutes, and I really appreciate that. I think you can do a lot inside 90 minutes. That said, you know, if you're going to go beyond 90 minutes, I think there can be great reasons to do longer films than 90 minutes, but it's got to be justified. And an hour into this film, I thought this film absolutely is not justified, that I've got to sit here for another 2 hours and 20 minutes before this finishes. At the end of it, I'm a little bit less certain. I think probably it doesn't justify 3 hours, 20 minutes, but I'm less certain than I was an hour in. So something happened. I think this film has a lot of themes and debates that, you know, I'm just fascinated in. So in terms of the substance, I think it's really attractive. You know, if you describe what this film is about to me, I'm going to be very drawn to this film. And I did find it very, you know, there was something of Dostoevsky, really, and how much religion and philosophy and politics you get in a Dostoevsky novel. I think where this was different than Dostoevsky was that it didn't have the wholeness of a Dostoevsky novel. It didn't have the characters didn't have the depth. It didn't have any emotion in it, really. It was like religion and philosophy on steroids. It was like a Dostoevsky religious debate, but just nothing else. And, you know, at times I found it suffocating in how unrelenting it was in just the level of debate and arrogance and elitism. And I mean, it's interesting watching it. I mean, I do understand quite a bit of French, but I still needed the subtitles to understand everything. And God, there's so much reading in this film, isn't there? With watching it where you don't, you know, you're not fluent in the language. You know, I found that really, really difficult and uncomfortable and annoying. You know, it wasn't conversation. It wasn't like they were talking with each other. They were lecturing to each other, and it was so annoying. And the fact that the characters didn't have any depth beyond just the intellect, it was pure intellect. You know, there was no emotional, even though there was a sick person involved and one of the characters was engaged with him, there was no emotion in this film. So it made it very, very one-dimensional. You know, obviously, at the most obvious level, this film is a kind of critique of class and elitism and arrogance and colonialism. And but, you know, I think it risks being kind of elitist in itself. You know, I think there's not that many people. You've got to be a pretty hardened art house cinema goer to really be open to getting something from this film. What did start to happen for me? The one thing I really find fascinating about this film is that when a break comes in the debate and discussion, there's such a sense of relief. I found that the moments when there was just a little moment of quiet or a moment of peace, or, you know, a moment when it started following one of the servers, you know, preparing the food or pouring the relief that came at those moments, because I did find, you know, the substance of the film and the unrelenting pace of the debate, and I found it just exhausting. And so to have these moments of relief actually was quite an interesting experience. You know, I thought, this is quite interesting. It's like grating away at you, and then it gives you a little bit of relief. And I found that I became really fascinated by the little things that were happening. I was really noticing what the staff were doing, how they were moving, the little noises they were making. You know, in some ways that becomes more important than just the drone of the conversation going on and on and on. And it actually is the thing that it's quite interesting how there were times when I was almost switching off the conversation and quite enjoying, you know, a little bit of movement or a little bit of noise coming from outside of the picture. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how there was often music playing in the background. You know, there were often or noises in the background. There were things going on in the background regularly, but we never really know what they are. But they become incredibly significant because they provide a kind of diversion away from just this relentless attack of, you know, the intellect. And I mean, I would say as the film evolved, it kind of weirdly drew me in a bit. I wouldn't say totally. I was always aware of how long I had to go in the film, and but I definitely knew I wanted to finish it. I really wanted to see where this film was going to go, and to give it a real fair chance. I mean, I think that, you know, obviously it made me think a little bit of Bunel and the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie, because, you know, that's about a dinner party, and, you know, there are some parallels with this film, but that is clearly satire. It's clearly comic at times. It's comedy. I can't tell if this film is satire. There are times when it does seem like satire, but there are other times when I think this film thinks it's serious, and you know, that has to be deliberate. Actually, I came to the view that has to be deliberate. This is not just a satirical film. I think I do have the feeling that this film is taking itself seriously and taking the debate that's occurring in it seriously. You know, there's an earnestness in the debate. And as I say, all of the issues discussed are quite interesting, and the way some of them evolve. And, you know, so that's kind of annoying but fascinating at the same time. And I mean, obviously 2 hours into the film, when suddenly there's all the characters in the film are killed, is, you know, that really changes things. You know, I'm so glad I didn't give up on it. You know, this is a film that if you were in the wrong mood, you could easily give up on before 2 hours. And I'm so glad I didn't give up on that, because obviously that is really a big change in the film. Beyond that, the film feels very different. And what I really loved about that was the scene after the killing, when we just see it goes outside, and it feels like, I didn't time it, but it feels like there's a scene for like 5 minutes where it's out in the snow, and we just see several people walking around, and we assume it's the characters, but we're unsure because we've just seen them dead. We've just seen them killed, but we're seeing them from a distance. And there's a stillness in that scene, and a relief. There's like the film breathes. It's like I can breathe for the first time in that film, because although there are moments of relief before that, it's like a complete change of pace. It's like nothing happens for several minutes. And, you know, and then of course it goes back into back with the characters again, and you realize that the film isn't linear, and that although the film is structured in, you know, clear parts which are numbered, it's not linear. So, you know, that again, that starts to make it you know, somewhat intriguing. I think the thing that I was really impressed with this film is the acting. I think the acting is really, really good. I mean, I just admire how hard it must have been to learn the lines. And, you know, sometimes were they speaking Russian sometimes? Because they were supposed to be Russian, I think, weren't they? But sometimes they were speaking Russian, and but mainly they were speaking French. I don't know what nationality the actors were. I didn't look at their names at the end. But, you know, if French isn't their first language as well, learning those lines in French, just phenomenal, you know, so complex and so, you know, and so I was just impressed by that. I thought that, you know, clearly they weren't supposed to show emotion, and they weren't supposed to show depth to their characters. That was clearly part of the film. But as a kind of exercise in endurance, I thought that those actors just did so well. You know, I was really, really impressed with that. I think overall, I found this film really hard work and annoying, but, you know, as a kind of piece of endurance, like a performance art piece, I kind of admire it. You know, I think that he has tried to do something quite courageous, and, you know, maybe it doesn't work, or maybe it does work. Maybe it's meant to be hard work and annoying. And, you know, I did just scroll down the page on Mubi a little bit, and I just saw a comment that he'd suggested that you need to watch it 3 times to understand what it's about. And God, the thought of sitting there for 10 hours, you know, I don't know if I could watch it again, but I'm kind of curious what the effect of that might be. So, you know, quite mixed feelings about it in the end. But overall, I don't think it's a success, but I think it does more than I thought 1 hour into it.
Well, I too struggled to work out how I felt about this film while I was watching it. I too had that experience about maybe 20, 25 minutes in, where I started thinking, I see, so they're just going to talk. And I knew already that it was going to be 3.5 hours long. And I thought, wow, this might be tough. I too enjoyed the debates in and of themselves. You know, I'm really interested in the ethical conversations they brought up. And then when they started talking about Europeanism versus Slavophilism, as you say, this is a Romanian film, but they're clearly Russian characters. And then it's hard to place it in terms of where it exists in history, until one of them mentions the Boer War as something that's happening then. So that puts it at exactly turn of the century. So this is a fin de sequel movie. This is in Russia. So we're 17 years before the revolution. So this is a film, I think, about the end of that way of life. And once I realized that's what was happening, I became really fascinated by what was going on here. The shades of Dostoevsky, I agree, they're certainly there. There's a short story by Dostoevsky of people, I can't remember exactly what happens, but they get trapped in a graveyard or something. There's this like chorus of voices all talking to each other. It's like Babel, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of that. And the themes that the kind of major schism between the intelligentsia of the 40s and the 60s. This is the 1840s and 1860s, and the radicalism that came out of that, which led directly towards the communism, which eventually, changed the country. All those debates are kind of they're really tied into the literature of that period. And so I found all of that really fascinating. There is a sense, I think, that this generation, first of all, I would say that it's fascinating, as you say, to pay attention to what's going on with the servants, because there was a moment where like no one can stand up until the servant pulls the chair out, and then they want to go outside and the servant has to open the door. And I found myself thinking, if ever there was a group of people who were just asking to be violently overthrown by the proletariat, this is it, right? This is, you've got it coming to you, right? And the little movie thing, as you say, I don't, likens it to Buñuel, says it's full of Buñuelian ironies. And you mentioned this fact that, you know, it does sort of call back to the Buñuel film. Is it Discreet Charm, you say, where they're all stuck in they can't leave. And it's interesting, you said you couldn't tell whether this was satire or not. And I couldn't either for a while, but I don't think it is satire. I think actually that there is finally a gravity and a loftiness to these conversations, that the fact, even though like Edouard, for example, who is pompous and arrogant and conceited and racist, there is nonetheless, this isn't a satire, this is a tragedy. And the fact that it's kind of an ambivalent tragedy is, I think, appropriate, because on the one hand, they get their comeuppance, you know, they get their comeuppance in the revolution, these sort of idle, conceited rich people who are finally put in their places. However, you know, it was, lots of people died and people were just robbed of all their possessions and ended up in the street digging up the roads, you know, literally overnight. So it's a tragedy for kind of everyone involved, everyone who was eventually betrayed by the revolution. And so I think it's appropriate that we don't necessarily like these characters, but we begin to get a sense of the tragedy that's coming to them. And I found the scene, as you say, it's really interesting, isn't it? That it is the sort of film that you could quite easily walk out of and think, you know what, I see what you're doing, but I don't know why you're doing it for 3 hours. But that scene 2 hours in, I thought was fascinating. And he when they ring the bell, and one of the characters says a few times, strange that no one comes, strange that no one comes. And you get a real sense of like how alarming and unnerving it would be. I think it captures very simply and very, very well this idea of what if everything that you thought of as the way things are, and they're so set in the idea that, you know, they are progressive and they are you know, further along morally than anyone has ever been before, and this is the way things should be, this is the way the world is, and that's right. And it suddenly articulates this terrifying idea of what if it all just fell apart. And so in 2 minutes it does, and they're just shot dead. And I read it differently. It didn't even occur to me that it was non-linear. I thought they'd been resurrected.
Oh, right.
And then suddenly they start having a conversation about resurrection. And so I actually read it as like a fantasy, this strange, peculiar, grave fantasy about history repeating itself. And, you know, that society kind of stuck in this loop almost of hierarchy and gross inequality. And you know, I haven't fully resolved what I think all that stuff is about. And I understand actually this, you know, watch it 3 times. I'm not going to watch it 3 times, but I can see, I think it is the sort of film that would yield more. If, you know, if one had the endurance to watch it again and perhaps again, I think it is a film that could keep giving and that has been really thoughtfully put together. And it took me a while to get to that point, but I'm really pleased I endured with it. I just felt to begin with that, just like you know, I've really enjoyed these 70, 80-minute films. I think it's great when you can get done what needs to be done in that. And if you're not, then, you know, as you say, you need to justify that. And so I found myself thinking, well, okay, if you're going to go on that long, why? What is it you're doing? And so with a good film, you then go on a quest with the filmmaker, because you're saying, look, why are you making me watch this? Why are you? Yeah. And so you're kind of, in a strange way, it made me more attached to the film, more fascinated by it. Because I'm thinking, really, you're just going to have characters talk to each other for 3 hours? You know, that's fascinating. Why? And so I felt really engaged with the film. And so for me, the conversations in and of themselves were about things that I'm fascinated by anyway. And so I found them compelling. The only thing I would say is that there's so much text that there were probably minutes at a time where I could barely see, I wasn't paying too much attention to the mise en scène, if you like, because I'm just reading most of the time. I did notice at the beginning, it's nicely blocked and there's good framing and, people in mirrors and portraits and, so it's nicely put together. But it's too talky to pay attention to that, if you're reading it rather than if you know the language. But all in all, I found it fascinating. I mean, I only finished it last night and I watched it in 2 chunks, and it's still kind of percolating. But I think it's a very, very good film. I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd go so far as saying it's a very good film, but I think I'm open to the fact that it might be.
Yeah.
I'm open to the fact that I might change on it. So there is something that kind of weirdly opened my mind to it. I felt very differently at the end of it,
yeah,
than I thought I was going to. So I agree about the scenery and the camera work, and I think it's very, I mean, for the first half hour, it feels like the camera doesn't move at all, and it feels like a play. In fact, the whole thing could be staged as a play, couldn't it? It's not. It's that's why it's such a relief when the camera goes outside for 5 minutes in the snow, because it kind of gives you some space. But for a good portion of at the start of the film, the camera is just fixed, and the way the actors are standing in relation to each other is like a play, and it's very unnatural. It's like there's something unnatural when when you see a play at the theater. I always think the characters that aren't speaking, they always look a little bit unnatural. They always look like actors on a stage, rather than kind of how someone would be listening to someone else speak. And it felt like that, because I don't think I think that in plays at the theater more than I do watching films. And, I did kind of feel that. But I think that, in some ways that was deliberate, wasn't it? And that definitely is just part of the intrigue of this film. And there's no doubt that something changes about the way it's shot throughout the film. The camera starts to move more as the film progresses. It tracks things a bit more. I did start to notice that. It flicks back and to between people. It films closer to them rather than being set back. Although then we get that very strange scene at the end, the final kind of act, where the actors are a long way from the camera, and most of them have got their back to the camera. And and it's like you can hear what they're saying, but the volume's very much reduced. It's typically a filmmaker wouldn't do that. I did kind of quite, I think the way it was shot, it probably that would merit watching it again, actually, to see exactly what, because I'm not sure what happened, but I do think that something changed. Something changes in the way it's shot throughout the film. I think that it's interesting about the non-linear thing, isn't it? And the resurrection. I wouldn't even have thought of that. I'd already started to question what, when we kept going into the room with the old man, like the bed's empty, they're making the bed. Then we're in the room where they're cleaning the guy, and sometimes one of the characters is at the door, or and I started to get a little bit confused as to when that was happening, whether that was the other people were in the other room, or so I hadn't started to think that it was non-linear, but I'd started to get a little bit confused by what order things were happening in. And so when that happened, I just assumed that we'd then gone back again. But But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because you're right, they talk about resurrection a lot. And, you know, so I think that's just one of the ambiguities that are in this film. I mean, I think it is really interesting how, you know, these people do feel pretty despicable as you as people. You know, it's hard to like them. But as you say, something happens. It's, I wouldn't say that I feel sympathetic towards them, but, you know, there's definitely something. There's something I'm slightly drawn into them. They weren't annoying me as much towards the end as they were at the beginning. And yeah, so I think it's, you know, this film's full of ambiguities, and it probably does. Yeah, like you, I don't think I'll do it, but it probably does deserve a second viewing to really unravel some of these questions.
I think it will definitely stay in my mind, and I think the more I think about it, I mean, it's a film about the end of the world, you know, because for these people it is the end of their world, and I do think it's a film about the revolution. And one of the things that kept occurring to me, a story that kept occurring to me, was reading this book about the abdication of the Tsar and the way the whole family was arrested and taken to Yekaterinburg. And the women, when they escaped, Alexandria and the two daughters, they sewed their jewels into their clothing. And so when they were killed and they were shot by machine gun and grenade and stuff, and they fired like hundreds, and it was like killing Bonnie and Clyde, they fired hundreds and hundreds of rounds into them. But because there were so many jewels in the women's dresses, it acted like a chainmail. And so they were kind of shredded by all these bullets and jewels. And that story kept occurring to me, this kind of, this sort of, this wealth and pomposity and conceitedness, and watching the film, knowing that it's not going to save them, knowing that actually it's their downfall. You know, they're going to die, these people, knowing it before they do, you know. And it's almost like, I think with that in mind, there was a sort of inevitability and a tragedy to it that, you know, as you say, it's hard to be sympathetic towards these people, but you certainly don't wish them dead, you know.
Yeah, true.
So it's,
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's a really fascinating movie. One that I think I'm happier to let what I did take from it sort of spend its time going around in my mind than to go back and start looking for more clues. You know, sometimes I prefer to just have an oblique film and let myself sort of make of it what I will, rather than go back and find stuff in the text itself. But I'm really pleased I watched it, and I'm glad we decided to put it on the podcast, because I'm not entirely sure. I'd like to think I would, but I'm not entirely sure I'd have stuck it out if I didn't know we were going to talk about it.
no, exactly. I think it's one of those films that merits from, I've enjoyed this conversation about it, and it does, yeah, as you say, I think I will continue to, I'm not going to forget it, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next one we're going to look at is a State Funeral by Sergei Lozhnitsa.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
Yeah.